Hello, hello! This video may be different than what I usually post. I had something completely different to be originally uploaded. However, there's been a change of plans. As I'm recording this, I'm getting closer to graduation. Actually, now that I'm reading the script, I've already graduated. And I figured, hey, why not use my knowledge of everything I've learned about game design in college and make YouTube videos out of them? So yeah, I hope you enjoyed my first attempt at doing something like this. Whether you want to pursue the world of game design or just someone who enjoys video games, you may have noticed that you gravitate towards certain games over others. Not only that, but there may be certain aspects of games that you may look for, while for some other video games, you may not be all that interested. Well, what if I were to tell you that there was a psychological test built around why players gravitate towards certain aspects of games? If you were to put 10 people in a room and make them play the same game, then later on ask them the main reason why they played the game, you would get a different answer from each participant. This is, in a nutshell, how said test was done. Bartle's Taxonomy. In this video, I'll be going over how this test came to be, what player types came out of this test, and how game designers use this knowledge to develop their game to cater to all these player types. With that out of the way, we shall begin. As given by the name of the test, this theory was created by Richard Bartle, who was the creator of the first multi-user dungeon, or MUD for short, back in 1978. For the next 16 years, he observed players on the way they were acting in multiplayer games. Then in the mid-90s, right when MMOs were about to make their debut, he released his theory on how game designers could divide players in a multiplayer setting based on what they wanted out of a multiplayer game. Remember that example I gave of asking people the reason for playing the game they just played? Well, that's what he did, except, a lot more than 10 people were involved. What he discovered was that the people he questioned had a lot of different reasons for playing the game, so Bartle decided to dig a little deeper and discovered that these reasons could be split into 4 different groups of players, each who played this game for different reasons. Bartle named these groups based on playing cards, although nowadays we refer to these groups as the following: Achievers, Explorers, Socializers, and Killers. Now, based on the names alone, you can already get a pretty good idea of what each player type would want most from a game. However, I feel that it is best to go over each one in depth to get a better idea. I will also be demonstrating how each player type is catered to in a favorite MMO of mine, Final Fantasy XIV Online. The reason is that this test was specifically made with a multiplayer environment in mind, and we'll see that as we play the game. I'll also mainly be focusing on the first area the player starts in, to put it in the perspective of a new player playing the game. The character we'll be using is a new character I made, who had just recently started her adventures in Limsa, who goes by the name Elwyn Dragonheart. Alright, with our character set up, we can finally jump into the game and see how it caters to all 4 player types, starting with... Achievers are people who play games to complete goals that are present in the game, both short-term and long-term, whether completing a level, maxing out the player character's level, beating the game, or even completing a side quest they've accepted. Achievers want to see those sweet completion screens when they eventually complete them. In Final Fantasy XIV's case, how they cater to achievers is quite simple, at least in the early game. Give them a lot of side quests to do alongside the mainline quests. Not only that, but every class, both the combat and the recreational ones, have their quests that get unlocked when the player reaches a certain level threshold. It may seem overwhelming at first, so the developers made them simple, such as delivering items, talking to people, or even using emotes for the pirate lady. That's right, this game introduces you to the emote system through a side quest. When's the last time you took part in an MMO quest that did that? There are plenty of other examples, but the point is that in performing these side quests, there are some to do but are still varied. Since I think I can speak for everyone when I say, performing the same fetch quest or kill X amount of enemies quest can become very dull and repetitive very quickly. The footage you're watching right now already contains me just exploring Limsa, completing quests, as well as finding all of the teleporters I decided to do as a personal little quest to commit to the role of an achiever, but I feel like my footage does this game as a service. It is not afraid to give you as much content as possible to start with. So we've got the part on how developers can keep their achievers invested, but how how can we reward these players for their efforts? Well, I mean, having some golden loot is a pretty nice reward, which is what Final Fantasy XIV does anyway, and who can complain? If a player's reward is receiving loot that is better than what they currently have, it feels rewarding and will make them want to keep playing to see what else they could get. There are other ways to do this, however they're less prevalent in MMOs and more so in other games, and I want to save that discussion after going over all 4 groups, so we'll put a pin in that as a reminder of what's to come. In the meantime, let's move on to... Explorers are players who simply want to, well, explore every new thing the game has to offer. This doesn't necessarily have to be exploring new places either, despite the name. It could be something like exploring the game's unique mechanics and how it functions. The game has unique mechanics that would make explorers want to experiment with them and see what potential they hold. To be more specific, the unique mechanics that each class, or as this game calls them jobs, stand out from each other. Let's use examples from the selection of starting jobs the player can choose when creating their character. The Thaumaturge is one of 3 magic classes the player can choose from, their main gimmick having to do with the first 2 spells the Thaumaturge can learn, Blizzard and Fire, which each have their effects that will stop when performing the other spell. This means the player will have to learn when to switch between the 2 spells, even getting another spell to make switching between the effects of Blizzard and Fire easier. Another example I can think of would be the class I chose for Elwyn, the Arcanist, where you get to summon a little buddy called a Carbuncle, and different Carbuncles perform different actions. Similar to the Thaumaturge, explorers can experiment with these carbuncles, studying their mechanics and seeing their potential. I could go on and on about these mechanics, but the point is that the mechanics these jobs have allow explorers to experiment, see what is possible, and ultimately find fun in exploring these mechanics. The main takeaway here is explorers want to see the mechanics the game has to offer. Now, the previous 2 groups we talked about had to do with how players want to interact with the world, also known as the game itself. However, these next 2 groups have to do with how players want to interact with each other, starting with... Socializers play games for the interpersonal aspect, the community itself. I probably shouldn't have to explain how MMOs can cater to these players, since the whole point of an MMO is to have players able to interact with each other simultaneously, but it goes a little deeper than that. While socializers are the types of players who you see trading, talking to people, forming guilds, and even helping new players, they want to be involved with the community. This is why some MMOs have specific game modes dedicated to players working together to defeat enemies the game throws at them, specifically bosses. Final Fantasy XIV does this too, and the bosses can be challenging, essentially requiring players to work together to take it down, although you don't have access to this part until much later in the game. Even in the main quest lines where players are expected to go through dungeons with a party, they can have the option to go through it with friends instead of the usual computers, allowing socializers to truly thrive both in and outside of the main game content. Even without access to this mode, even early on in the game, you can tell how much the community is thriving by how packed it is, especially in the main area where the giant teleporter stone is contained. There's even a level of player playing music. How quaint! Whether or not you're interested in interacting with other players, seeing a thriving community like this with so many players is a socializer's dream. Although, there are players who don't necessarily interact with other players and more so against them. That last player group is what we refer to as... we have the Killers, who are players that... What the fuck was that voice crack? Finally, we have the killers, who play games purely for dominance, plain and simple. What do I mean by that? Well, have you ever played Mario Party with someone where whenever they're winning they put it in other people's faces? It's kind of like that with killers. Killers thrive on winning and causing misery to other players, knowing they're most likely swearing at their monitors about how they could have possibly lost is exactly what killers seek out. Games that offer some kind of PvP are where killers can especially thrive, as they're quite literally made to make the other player lose to secure victory. Killers are the types of players that want to prove that they not only mastered the game's mechanics, but have mastered them better than their opponent. Game designers do need to be wary of killers, however. While killers have been proven to be the rarest of the 4 player types according to Bartle's research, in fact only 1% of the people Bartle interviewed reported to be killers, their competitive nature shouldn't go unnoticed. If a killer is left free to use whatever tactics they want to defeat all of the other players around them, it can ruin the fun for the other players. So game designers have to take into account what killers would like to have in the game, without having to take away the fun from other not very competitive players. While Final Fantasy XIV does offer some PvP options, it is more well known for its PvE options. So how does PvE satiate a killer player's competitiveness? Well, remember when I mentioned how the game has some difficult bosses that require players to work together to take down together? Well, that works out for killers too! After all, who says being able to defeat AI enemies wouldn't give killers the same sense of victory when they defeat them? Some killers take the form of guild leaders, taking charge as their guild works together to take down parties. When killers finally do defeat those bosses, they feel ecstatic. Who wouldn't be after taking on such a difficult boss? What I'm trying to say here, folks, is that PvE having AI enemies for killers to dominate is more than enough to satiate their competitive nature. Whether by themselves or within a team, all our killer cares about is winning. One more thing before I switch to the next section, don't think of killer players as a sort of evil players, as that's not true at all. Just because a player is competitive doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad. They could be pretty chill outside of games for all you know. What is bad, however, is when that player uses their competitiveness as an excuse to ruin the fun for other players, and at that point, it's only a matter of time before they get banned or simply get left out depending on the game. The message to take away from this is that all killers are competitive players, but not all competitive players want to ruin the fun for others. They just want to win fairly, just like everyone else. After identifying these 4 player types, Bartle created a simple system that allowed designers to consider them when designing their games, especially MMOs, since developers have to consider all 4 player types as it's what makes up the MMO genre as a whole. There is, however, one critique worth mentioning, as it can be argued that this system is mainly for MMOs, and while that is certainly the case, you can still use the system for non-MMO games as well. Let me go over how each player type can be catered to. Firstly, when it comes to achievers, having an achievement system is a great way to cater to them if the name hasn't already given that away. Achievers are players who want to complete the game's endgame goal, so what better way than to offer them goals that are above and beyond what we expect the average player to do. In addition, having a way to award achievers for their work such as a New Game Plus works. New Game Plus essentially allows the player to play the game again, but with the experience they gained from their first playthrough. For example, in Fire Emblem Three Houses, after a player completes their first route, when they unlock New Game Plus, the player is given renown to spend on things such as Professor level, supports, and other features that are in the game. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. What I'm trying to say here is when it comes to achievers, developers should focus on systems that reward these types of players for wanting to work towards endgame goals. For explorers, I've already talked about how explorers can be pleased when you give them new mechanics to explore and learn about, and that works with pretty much any game genre. I say this because when you give an interesting and unique mechanic to explorers to play around with, they're likely to discover new purposes for it that not even the developers could think of. An example of this will be in Breath of the Wild, where there's a neat trick used especially by speedrunners discovered simply by messing around with the mechanics offered by the game itself, which is best known as the tree launch method. This method occurs when the player chops down the tree, then uses a stasis upgrade before the tree can fall. Hit the tree a few more times with their chopping weapon of choice, shoot the tree, and then climb onto the tree all before the player shoots up into the sky with a faster, more convenient, and admittedly fun method of travel. All of this had been discovered by some player who was messing around with the mechanics offered by the game, most likely an explorer, which has led to it becoming a staple in the speedrunning community, and is most certainly something the developers didn't initially count for when they were designing the mechanics used to make this trick possible. So go on and let your Explorer players experiment and have fun figuring out the mechanics in your game. Socializers are easy to consider when making any multiplayer game since, you know, the whole point of them is to have players interact with one another. However, this isn't always the case. What if you were making a single player game but wanted to include a way for socializers to have fun too? Well, just include NPCs for them to interact with. Even if there isn't any multiplayer functionality, having memorable characters for players to interact with and grow attached to is a good way to make up for it. Games like Animal Crossing and the Harvest Moon games, now known as Story of Seasons, are two well-known examples that do this, as they have memorable characters that a player can talk to and even give gifts, becoming friends with these NPCs as they get further into the games. Of course, well-written characters are a completely different story that dives more into writing rather than game design, but the point is having NPCs can help attract socializers to the game. Finally, for killers, the point I made earlier about having in-game enemies for them to fight against and win over works for non-MMO games too. In fact, there are so many games that I can list here since it's common knowledge that if your game includes fighting in it, there's going to be enemies the player will have to win against. Of course, games with PvP or some kind of competitive element appeals to killers too, as the entire point is for the best player to come out on top. There are numerous games I can list that fit these criteria. Mario Party, Mario Kart, Monopoly, literally any multiplayer fighting game in existence. Even social deduction games like Among Us, I swear to god if someone makes a meme since I said the name of the funny game, and Goose Goose Duck have a competitive aspect to it too, as it's one side trying to beat the opposing side, or in Goose Goose Duck's case, depending on what rules are enabled, sides. The point is, if you give your game some kind of competitive aspect, with the player needing to beat the other players or enemies, killers are more than eager to take on that challenge when playing your game. As you can see, you don't need to use Bartle's taxonomy exclusively for MMOs. You can use this method for any game that isn't an MMO. So, now that I've gone over everything I wanted to say, what are my overall thoughts on the Bartle taxonomy system, or the Player Taxonomy system, depending on what you prefer? In case I hadn't made myself clear, I'd say that this system is a great tool to use when considering your audience. Emphasis on the word tool. Yes, I'm considering this system to be a tool rather than a full-fledged guide, mainly because when designing your games, think of things such as, if I implement this feature, how would achievers think of this? What about explorers? It's such a rigid way of thinking. It's your game, and you're in control of what you think of as right for your game. Think of Bartle taxonomy as a tool for identifying what kind of audience you want to attract. Also, it's fine if your game doesn't attract all 4 player types like an MMO can. Not every game can attract every type of player that exists. If you want to make a Mario Party-like game that attracts socializers that want to play with their friends and killers that are in it to win, that's fine. If you want to make an action game that lets killers have fun taking down their opponents with unique fighting mechanics where explorers poke and prod at to discover new methods on how to use them, that's fine. If you want to make a game all about collecting every collectible for achievers to strive for, as it is the game's endgame goal, that is fine. Again, it's your game, and you have the right to decide what's right for your game and what kind of audience you want to attract. As long as you consider what your audience is playing games for and what they want out of the game, you're one step closer to making a game that you and your audience can enjoy. Thank you for watching. This is my first time making this kind of video, so if you have anything in mind that I can improve on, or if I had gotten anything wrong, please feel free to comment down below. If you like this video, please feel free to leave a like, and if you're curious as to where else I take this shift in content, feel free to subscribe as well. Yeah, this is my first time doing this like and subscribe shtick, but I'm a college graduate now with plenty of free time until I truly embrace adulthood and work in the hours of the night at whatever company I potentially could be working for. So what the heck, let's try this to see where the channel goes. I've recently encountered another player taxonomy system while making this video that seems to be catered towards non-MMO games, so if you guys are curious, I might make a follow-up video going over that system, but enough rambling from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye!